Let's learn this week's Parsha Mishpatim with Rashi's commentary. Before we get into specific verses in chapter 22 of the book of Exodus, let's remember the beginning of the Torah portion this week. Ve'ele hamishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. And these are the rulings, the judgments, the laws, the case law that you need to know, that you will put before them. When Moses teaches the judges the laws according to the Torah, sure, Moses could take the formulaic way that the Ten Commandments outline. Don't kill, don't steal. But Parshat Mishpatim gets into details that will help judges adjudicate between the human beings who live in community with each other. And not only that, we notice that the Vav of Ve'ele isn't just there to be a conjunction. The Vav of Ve'ele begins Parshat Mishpatim to remind us that it's not only Jewish ritual law and laws that mediate between us and God that make up the body of Jewish law, but that Jewish law, halakha, the tradition of having Jewish laws, extends to the realm of fellow human beings. We ourselves, as human beings, about our thoughts, feelings, actions, decisions, responsibilities. Yes, and rights, but first and foremost, responsibilities. And then the laws that mediate everyday living between us and others in society. This parsha that comes right after the Ten Commandments is not about the building of the Mishkan or the tabernacle. It's not about the special implements and instruments we need to create a relationship with God or the sacrifices. The first Torah portion after the giving of Torah at Sinai, or the Ten Commandments, is the Torah portion that enumerates and articulates the kind of Jewish laws that create specific case law or common law. Of course, in the Western world, we're familiar with common law, very popular mode of adjudication among judges and magistrates throughout blossoming democracies and democracies of our age. Very different than codific law, by the way. And for another time, we'll talk about the difference between the reliance upon common law versus the application of codes in order to figure out certain penalties for certain actions. The Torah presents these as codes, yet as common law, and creates within the Torah portion a little bit more about the spirit of the law than just the very codific conditions of the law, which is not necessarily noticed every time you look through the detailed cases that are presented in Parshat Mishpatim. And where do we get the spirit of the law coming through? Not only in the pshat of the Torah itself in chapter 22, which is verses 20, 21, and 22 of chapter 22, but in Rashi's commentary as well. And so that's why we're going to focus in here on chapter 22, verses 20 through 22, with Rashi's commentary. The Torah says, "V'ger lo toneh, v'lo tilchatzenu." Someone who is not exactly from the Israelite community, who lives among you, do not oppress him. Ki gerei meitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because your historical experience mediates the way that you're going to treat him interpersonally. And the point is, even in the court of law, even though we have created case law and rules about Canaanite slaves who might be treated differently than Israelites, about non-Jews who might be under the law, categorized differently vis-a-vis our laws of manslaughter and even murder, because that's what the previous chapters of the Torah portion were about. The Torah comes back in chapter 22 to say, you might want to refine the application of these laws that are more like common law than statutory, and apply these values as you evaluate the application of the law. 21. Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun. The Torah portion here strikes a prophetic sound, or the prophets are borrowing from this section of the Torah, which we don't always connect either. You shall not persecute any widow or orphan. It doesn't say the Jewish widow or orphan, even though some might think it implies it. Maybe there are widows and orphans who are now part of your community. Maybe they fit into other categories, what you thought was neatly. But now, given their status and given the reality of mitigating circumstances in their lives, or just the circumstances that they happen to have in their lives, you're going to think about that as you consider the who is before you versus just the law that you have to apply. And further, im anata aneoto, if you will persecute him, ki im tza'ok yitz'ak elai shomea eshma tza'akato. God says, if he will cry out to me, I will surely hear that cry. So this is one of those unique verses, verse 22, where we have an incomplete phrase that sets up a realm of possibility. If he will cry out to me, I will hear him. That, in the second half of the verse, is clear. But the first half, if you will persecute him, ... you have to be careful. You have to see that the application of the law is about the human being who's standing before you. You have to let the values that you've learned from your experiences of history filter in to your ability to be an ethical judge. And as a student of the law or a member of society that has expressed these laws and that God has planted them in, when they are applied and when you consider them, hard and fast to the letter would be too much to ask, because there's an obvious human factor within the legal system that creates space for the righteous application of these laws. Rashi goes on to tell us that you shall not persecute any widow or orphan. Hu hadin l'chol adam. You shall consider applying the same law to every person. Whereas the Torah just got done telling us about different categories, as I mentioned with the chapters of Parshat Mishpatim before. The Torah is moving us towards an application of the law of justice, of righteous law, that could apply to everyone equally. Lefi shehem teshushei choach. Because in the end, these are examples of the weakest in society who need our understanding, who demand our considering their mitigating circumstances or stories of their lives. As you had the story of enslavement in Egypt, perhaps others have a story that impacts what's doing by way of their responsibilities under the law. V'davar matzui la'anotam, and persecuting them might be common. Once you've checked whether or not you are mistreating or errantly applying the laws that you have on the books, then the opportunity comes for the person to cry out to God. If it's true that there has been a misguided application or errant application of the laws that have been legislated through Parshat Mishpatim, God will surely hear. But this does not mean that we entirely abandon the systems of crime and punishment, of laws about crimes and punishment, of civil tort law that exist, as they were, again, enumerated in the chapters before these couple of verses. There is empathy, there is sympathy, and there is the demand for justice. And so when we consider Parshat Mishpatim as a law book, we sense the spirit of the law as it comes to meet the strict code of the law, that is a more expansive code than are the Ten Commandments, which also speak to some specifics, yet a great spirit. The spirit is life and humanity have to be respected and have to be considered. One's situation, one's character, one's experience in life, standing before the court, standing before the judge, can be weighed. Of course, that does not mean we ignore the need for the application of the case law as it exists, and sometimes even laws that we may have to refine or come to determine, given the unique circumstances that are part of anyone's case. In fact, the unique circumstances of every case that's outlined in our Torah portion this week comes to exemplify how fact-finding is such an essential part of our legal systems, of legal systems that pursue righteousness and justice. Shabbat Shalom.